Hello. So today I'm going to talk about the next chapter of British politics UK, and I looked into the media and how that affects the British political arena. And this was a very interesting topic. I have to admit, it was very informative. I try to cut down the summary, but I still will give you a brief summary, as brief as I can make it, and then an analysis afterwards. You can always, of course, just skip straight into my analysis. The chapter starts with a bit of a history about the media. So pamphlets used to be the radical form that were used as a method of communication, as opposed to how word of mouth, especially amongst the privileged elite, was how communication and media was spread in the 16th and 17th century. And even into the Industrial Revolution, this was still a new phenomenon that people were adopting through pamphlets. So during the Industrial Revolution, orators also were becoming a popular method of spreading communication as people were living in more closer quarters, especially in London. And from this, in the late 19th century, there was also newspapers that radically shaped how information was being shared by giving it to all people virtually. And government supported their efforts as they were courted by politicians for influence at the time. So the press usually has been traditionally a pro-conservative bias, but by the 90s, as John Major was growing unpopular and Tony Blair came into power, it shifted more in Labour's favor, especially as the people too were generally becoming more in favor of Blair. The newspaper conditioned habit has been on decline actually recently, especially from the youth. And tabloids hold relevance regardless of inaccuracies because politicians also pay attention to what tabloids are saying. So broadcasting became an effective channel of communication from interwarriors into World War II, as well as war propaganda to give public support for government. So the British Broadcasting Corporation had a monopoly over media since its inception in 1926, but was later broken up by the emergence of ITV and radio. And the BBC did eventually receive multiple channels like BBC Two amongst others, but come the introduction of Sky News and its 24-hour news cycle, it was starting to compete with BBC's rolling services, and it still is to this day. The BBC claims to be unbiased, but both sides of the political aisle consider it biased against them. There are clear age distinctions, as the elderly see it as too left-leaning and the youth see it as more right-leaning, as well as a debated approach in how it tries to balance political topics, including one instance where a dialogue on climate change had invited both a scientist of climate change and a climate-denying politician. So recent development of GB News, so Great Britain News, has also been equivalent in trying to act like a right-leaning news outlet, like a Fox News for the UK. And just recently, this year in 2025, Ofcom, the investigative body into journalism and media broadcasting, after investigating GB News as a biased media, dropped its investigation into the organization by saying that it was more of a current affairs program and not news, and therefore does not require the same scrutiny as news would. So the media also proves itself as an influencer in how viewers and thus Britons perceive the world and politics through their programming, i.e. shows about family values might align them with some conservative values, or any shows about or movies about satire about institutions might align them more with Labour governments. And the fact that governments react to this by trying to prohibit the projection of some of these beliefs to the public just shows how effective it is in political discourse. The celebrity politician is becoming an appealing figure in UK politics, as figures like Boris Johnson, who never steered away from the type of stunts and public appearances that a few decades ago would have cost any UK politician their career. This seems most captivating by bringing humanity to politicians, it seems. So the US's advertising approach with large media teams, rallies, and sound bites are also being utilized in UK politics to not necessarily give voters all the information that they need, but precise statements like "Get Brexit done." Broadcasters are a necessary tool where politicians must speak in a more personal and direct tone when appearing on TV or even on social media as a way for the voter to connect with them more intimately than in the traditional orator approach that doesn't really connect well in a familiar, closer context. How a politician looks also says a lot about them and their party and what it's and it becomes necessary for them as image building can sometimes transform a politician and a party entirely. Similarly, brand image is important as David Cameron had fixed the Conservatives' nasty party status by employing him as a more tolerant, younger, and likable figure who didn't try to act like he knew more than the voters. So the party leader debates in 2010 played a huge role, many say, as Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democrats' attractive and confident look for his party what brought a relatively unsupported party to the front that eventually made coalition with the winning Conservatives. Some speculate that Cameron's choice to debate with him only hurt the Conservatives, but when he did debate with him again, he seemed to have bested Clegg and possibly salvaged the Conservatives from a possible worse turnout in 2010. Theresa May's decision in 2017 to call elections and not to debate Jeremy Corbyn made her already fragile campaign look worse, as many perceived her as cowardly. So you can see how debate has played into political competence. Tony Blair had always thrived in the press, and many appreciated how natural he was. And although his successor Gordon Brown still remained authentic to the public, he was a shyer leader who didn't bode well with voters, especially after his comments about a voter who he referred to as a bigot. And from Cameron's similar to Blair's likable approach at the time towards the media that was also more attractive compared to Brown, even if at times his attempts were quite obvious. The media is also becoming a primary source for ministers to communicate with the public, as the House of Commons is losing its relevance as the original source of political discussion. Local elections and politics have also begun to lose relevance to the media's highlighting of national news, it seems. Prime ministers have been actively working, especially since the time of Thatcher, to get the media in closer proximity to 10 Downing Street. And spin doctors have been a prominent figure of politicians, especially since Blair, as they act as shadowy figures who will manipulate the media's narrative about what their leaders are trying to say, and this has caused some concerns. This has contributed to a lack of trust from the public in their leaders and is linked by many with the lower voter turnout in 2001 during Blair's time. And these figures remain still relevant, as many see it that the politicians' attempt to manipulate the media is almost as natural for them to breathe the air, as the book highlighted. Although it's a difficult concept to measure, gossip's secrecy also influences media, especially amongst higher-ups who are in positions of power. Tabloidization of media has become more expected and is creating this race to the bottom amongst tabloid companies to attract viewers to the most sensationalist of statements. The phone hacking scandal of 2011 was highlighted as an instance where a News of the World organization was found compliant with its reporters' efforts in invading the privacy of the royal family's phones. The Leveson inquiry launched into this, and it found that the culture of illegal behaviors was prevalent and recommended that the government, under Cameron at the time, adopt a press regulatory body to deal with this issue. Now, this actually became an issue of freedom of speech and press for many. Pressure groups have also worked to harness the media for their own causes as they bring attention to their own political whims. And some arguments of how voters vote based on media behavior, there's multiple arguments. This could be either in selective exposure, where people only hear what they want to hear, selective perception, as voters only take info they use to edit what they already believe, and selective retention, as voters choose what to remember from the media. But probable in these studies that found voters would also switch their votes. So it was also found that voters would also switch their votes 4 weeks before the election, and this might have to do with the media's role in this. So it's not entirely one or the other's autonomy in that. So the pervasive usage of media has recently made prime ministers use every day as a campaign, essentially. Either you win or you lose today. So there is the pluralist view of democracy on the media, as it is seen as informing society on government to its citizens and acting as a watchdog on their behalf. But this is challenged by the capitalist interests of businesses, from figures like Rupert Murdoch, who insert a biased agenda and call it news, and thus, as is playing out now, this strips news of its accountability, especially as efforts from findings like the Leveson inquiry prove themselves ineffective as making the media be held accountable. We see that public interest tends to lie in personalities, revelations, disasters, and even visual-backed media. And for most media outlets, adopting a more distorted reality approach is more resonating to viewers, even at the cost of what viewers see as the boring yet accurate reporting. Additionally, companies like the BBC are vulnerable to government intervention, with Thatcher's relentlessness in her time in trying to change the BBC to make it from what she saw as a left-leaning media to be more neutral, and did this through placing some right-wing policies like members and trying to introduce advertisements to the body. But there's also a different way of looking at the media, and the Glasgow University Media Group's findings on how the media tends to blame the British workforce for economic issues up to 1976 backs this view. And this is a view that aligns with Marxist views of the media, as it is seen that the ruling class runs the media, and thus their issues are broadcasted to make it sound like the interests of the whole nation. Many of Corbyn's supporters aligned with this belief, that the media was out to get them by perceiving journalists as the ruling class, or at least their puppets. And it seems like the media is neither the pluralist nor the Marxist view, or at least not enough of one to call it that. The internet has also emerged as a new phenomenon in how media is consumed with rapid speed and a more democratic inclusion to virtually all. Social media has been closing, at least by the publication of the book in 2022, as the prime media. Looking into how the people are drawn to these characters, and especially humanistic features, is an aspect that I want to look into. So reading this chapter, I gained a new perspective on the recent surge in populist politics. So we conventionally have come to see the populist surge as strongly associated with going against the tradition of liberal democratic governance, where an administration or non-governmental organizations are given legitimacy to act as the conveyors of democracy. And the people would usually trust their leadership, preferably unequivocally. This has been challenged for some time now, as citizens have grown increasingly distrustful of these institutions that they once believed would protect them all. What we see in this spike in populist politics lies in the prominent feature of populism, which is the people's resonance and feeling regarded by their leaders. One aspect that has been undertaken in the British and American political contexts is the sense of humanity that citizens perceive in their leaders. So David Cameron's initial approach up to his premiership was to portray himself as a new direction for the Conservatives, as they were perceived as a so-called nasty party up to his leadership of the party. And he didn't make himself seem like the traditional intolerant to social change character that the Conservatives have been increasingly defined by. And even his manner in not acting like a know-it-all politician who simply preached to the people, but tried to show humility in his leadership, was quite engaging and captivating. The same can be said for Tony Blair, who never shielded away from the press, even in his attempts to dress younger, or Boris Johnson's appearances on television as a way to show himself beyond a simple political figure when doing provocative stunts like driving a bulldozer into a Brexit wall, or zip-wiring when he was London mayor to express national pride. Many can consider these attempts as tasteless, just to make voters think that for 2 minutes this politician looks more authentic and would somehow be better than the other traditional politicians, only for them to be just as likely disliked as previous politicians once they get in power. But the fact that the people continue to be both captivated and feel a sense of connection with these figures says a lot about the British and American electorates. Donald Trump's maverick relationship with Twitter in the late 2010s showcased a personable characteristic that many felt a similar, closer connection to than with the traditional institutional bodies that remain separate and above the electorate, as has been the political structure of most liberal democratic governments. Therefore, when I see the British similarities and connect them with the American electorate and what they pay attention to and crave in political figures, It is this sense of humanity where citizens crave, at least on the surface level, a person behind the politician's mask of authority. Even the flaws and unfiltered parts in them only resonate more with citizens in perceiving the populist figure as more authentic than the traditional politician who conceals their non-statesman-like attitude and behavior from the public. There's also this almost reality TV-esque feature where we know it's not entirely authentic what they present to us in public, but we still love to see something that draws our attention, no matter how rambunctious or flamboyant the politician is or acts. An American figure like Donald Trump fits this criteria for populist appeal, as he knows how to take advantage of the media to present himself as not necessarily a well-liked character, but perceptibly authentic, who embraces the most boisterous of claims, something that bodes well with voters, it seems. Returning to the point about politicians acting like reality TV stars, I want to look into how this is also an aspect that they pay heed to with spin doctors and other figures that work to spin the media in their favor. Many see this as a terrible thing, as politicians are essentially highlighting their orchestrated successful moments and occulting the ugly truths they don't want in the public eye. But I can't say I can entirely blame them for those actions and see this as purely a selfish act when in fact politics is increasingly becoming reality TV sized, or however one calls that, but becoming like a reality TV show. Since the emergence of the 24-hour news cycle, social media platforms that deliver rapid news, and the increasing obsession people have in sensationalism, unlike something like reality TV culture or just from scrolling through social media, this culture and all this have been working together in our politics, and politicians have had to undergo an incredibly scrutinizing press that demands updates on virtually anything the public can get a hold of. We have to keep in mind that the ability of cameras to live stream a prime minister going from Downing Street to Buckingham Palace is such a new phenomenon, as many used to have to wait for this news to be printed out and wait for some time to publish, and that was only for moments worth the media's attention. Now that a cell phone can stream all moments, both critical and trivial, there is no room for ignoring the media once it's right in one's face. And since politics is a game of wins and losses, you will likely have half the country waiting for you to slip and fall and call you an incompetent leader and given the tools to monitor one's every move. From this argument, there is a reason why spin doctors and media manipulators have been incorporated in the personal and thus political lives of politicians, because politics is about leadership, and the ability to monitor a leader virtually 24/7 requires the same amount of counter control in the form of people who can straighten out the media to not continuously criticize and let the leaders work away from the constant scrutiny that might undermine sensitive objectives of the government. As social media democratize political debate, everyone can have a voice on anything, no matter their credentials. And because of this, the scale of media scrutiny is no longer just from reporters, but it is now from virtually all citizens who are able to both see their leaders more closely and are able to air out their views and beliefs on them for others to hear. This scale of unprecedented scrutinization is perhaps also pushed further by the reality TV complex that has emerged since the late 21st century, where the drama and at times the low-class storytelling of blown out of proportion moments that become sensational, no matter how minor of importance it is to the viewer's life, is another element worth considering and why politicians have been manipulating the media to their benefit. Because it is developing public behavior, leaders need to be cautious that they don't become a figure of ridicule, because they have more on the line than just their career, but also their respective locality or nation that they work for and represent. Therefore, if they are ridiculed or attacked the same way a reality TV star gets attacked, and these characters of reality TV usually carry no political importance in their status, it becomes a crisis depending on the scale in governance or national health or even security if one misspoken comment about becomes a cause for concern, when it could be that they weren't in the clearest mindset at the time, or they simply didn't express themselves well but had good intentions. Unfortunately, good intentions are not what are followed in the reality TV complex, it seems. And while it might be a minor offense in that culture of reality TV and just sensationalism, it could be a more crucial concern in the political world, and thus requires appropriate scrutinization against that as well. Jumping off the theme of people's drawn interest to sensationalism and what can at times be inaccurate statements about related political topics, I began to wonder to myself, is this contributing to an assault on democracy and the democratic systems we've upheld for so long? Or is this personalized spread of political engagement in fact only making our world more democratic? In our age of information that is becoming incredibly digitally accessible, we are overwhelmed by the variety of facts and sources related to all themes that pique our interest. Politics is no exception. And just like the spread of so much information that we develop our own beliefs and sentiments on topics that not that long ago would have taken years to reach us and more years for us to contribute to the community, politics is also becoming more widespreadly and rapidly accessible for people to form their own political opinions on. We are now seeing that with the combination of so much information and rapid speed in forming our own knowledge, politics is becoming more personalized than before, as there are more voices able to publish their beliefs on YouTube or TikTok. We can see this as incredibly concerning because this is an unprecedented time in political history as we enter a post-truth era where facts are not the only basis of political action, but also sentiments. And the increase in scale in people being able to both have and express sentiments is groundbreaking to our political culture. But let's recall that politics has never truly been about mere facts versus opinions, as opinions have always had a key role in how policy is implemented. Politics has always had a constant battle between implementing what felt like a right policy at the time versus eventually having to deal with the issues that have arisen from implementing a specific policy. We can look to the Industrial Revolution, which was a time when governments aimed to make the world more efficient through industrialization, which it did, but it also made economic inequality and environmental degradation, which are now the aims of government's efforts to undo. Politics throughout history was never about one correct fact prevailing. It was simply about actions taken that we now look back on and either consider a fine action because it can link us to where we are today, or an action that we can criticize and try to do better next time. I think many fear this as a time of unprecedented and thus formidable change, as it is an understandable instinct for humans to see change as intimidating. But just like what happened in the past, no one knew what would become of the future, and surely not that we'd be where we are today. So I think rather than see this as an unsettling time, we should see it simply on its base level as a transitory period, where we face this question of what will become of the future of political thought as we enter an era where sentiments become just as relevant as facts. I think there is a positive outlook from which we can perceive this change, because unlike back then, there wasn't this much of an active democracy where many people have been able to question and come together for massive political action and change, as traditionally it had usually been implemented by those in government who have been at the top and away from the masses, and usually at such a slower pace. Perhaps this change is, after all, more democratic, in that we will see what the masses value beyond their votes for leaders that will sometimes become diluted and filtered out by political parties and thus not express some of the voters' more authentic beliefs. And if this still remains unsettling, then we might finally see, after all, just how effective the experiment of democracy is in upholding its basis of for the people, by the people, and whether this is truly an effective method of governance after all. So the US does not have the same influential state-backed public media services like the UK has with the BBC. We have something like NPR, but it's more minor. Many of the American left tend to support policies that involve the government supporting public radio or similar public communications services, and perhaps they would support something like the BBC in its structure with governmental ties. However, from reading this chapter, we can see the BBC is no flawless system in its relationship with government, as it has been accused of being too much on the side of current governments, been seen by the left as too right-wing leaning, seen by the right as too left-wing leaning, and essentially is seen as going against the working class as a ruling class product to some Marxist views. So from this constant heckling by multiple groups as going against their own respective groups, I find it safe to say that the BBC seems to be doing a stellar job in continuously being questioned and criticized by the public and what I think is the goal of the media giants in being impartial news that does not have clear bias for one side. The media will never be a completely favored body because it is run by people, and all people have their biases, and not everyone has the same biases/beliefs. It makes sense that Thatcher would find it too left-leaning because she from the right can recognize where this national body goes at odds with her beliefs, and so can Corbyn's supporters, as they saw it as too much in government's favor when it was under conservative rule during Corbyn's leadership. What can come up from this constant disagreement between multiple bodies of political beliefs is the concept of mutually assured resentment, similar to the phrase agree to disagree, in which both sides are upset and thus not being the complete beneficiary of the BBC support. This is perhaps the only healthy mix the media can position itself as, since it can almost never be totally fair in everyone's eyes. Instead, being seen as unfair to all, it provides its legitimacy in terms of never being on one political aisle or political theory side because it is continuously seen as not in favor of that side enough. This is the sweet spot that the BBC finds itself in, I would say, because it almost acts like an outed double agent who doesn't please anyone, but somehow seems to be pleasing the other one too much and can reasonably be considered then as not biased for one side. Which is better than an outlet that has the support of one side, that side not denying that it benefits from the supportive coverage like Fox News or New York Times. From this, the BBC and its inability to be well liked by a range of political thought is doing its job quite well by never showing evident bias or support for one, and it remains the punching bag for everyone to mutually agree is not satisfactory to their own distinctive political likings. I feel this is also a great example of fine journalism, where they continue to make their patrons uncomfortable in how they don't align with their biases or on what the world should be. Because the BBC will feel like it is going against your beliefs as well as those of everyone else's. And when I think about how the BBC has continued to function in British society and politics especially, I feel that this type of body that in theory is state-supported but still independent in its journalism, yet continues to be heckled by all for being too against their beliefs, would be of a similar benefit to a nation like the United States in providing the same sense of journalistic debate that in the end only proves just how effective the body is in working not fully to one's benefit. Disagreement brings people together in this case, a bedrock of political debate. And it might make me sound biased for the BBC, but I appreciate how much it continues to stir up debate. And I wish others could see this in the bigger picture context to see how invaluable of an institution this actually is. Summarize what I was just talking about. So there is a growing sense in populism that people are attracted to authenticity, regardless of if it's liked authenticity or not liked, because there is a sense of disconnection with what has usually been the traditions of politicians, and thus showing a sense of humanity, no matter how funny or even politically incorrect it can be, is really captivating for many people. Also, the usage of figures like spin doctors and trying to manipulate the media for politicians' favor does come with the reasonable backing that it is as a response to the fact that there is so much more scrutinization by the people and by the public than has never been seen before, and thus is seen as a more counter support to help with this, especially in something as serious as politics that can't be afforded the same type of ridicule something like reality TV can be. And also the fact that there is also a growing sense of concern that we are in this unprecedented and thus dangerous time in our political or democratic politics. But there's also the possibility that this just might be becoming more democratic and that we're seeing something very authentic in development by having people air out their most weirdest of views and for all to have to pay attention to in some regards. And finally, the BBC, as a unique institution that is not liked by any side, seems to be doing its job quite well, I would say, because it is showing that it just gives the news, and as much as we can say it is too much on one side, the other side doesn't think the same. So therefore, this is just a news broadcast that continuously scrutinizes and criticizes, which might be the goal of journalism and trying to look impartial as the BBC tries to be. So thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.